All right, my friends, we are going to officially get started. Thank you so much for joining us. It's lovely to have you here. We are talking about the IDEA project research. IDEA, as you all know, stands for inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And we're here today joined by our researcher, Bounmy, who will introduce herself in a short while to share with you all about the research that we have done to date. My name is Rahana Hirji Kalfan. I am the National Director at Race and Disability Canada. And we have a nice agenda for you today. But just in terms of to put myself in context, I'm a visibly Muslim woman, which means that I wear a hijab, a headscarf that covers my hair and my neck. And my choice of color today is pink. And I'm also wearing a black and white keffiyeh draped over my right shoulder in solidarity with the Indigenous Palestinians in Gaza who are currently undergoing a genocide. Let me just move to the next screen. So in terms of our agenda for today, I will talk a little bit about Race and Disability Canada, who we are, where we came from, and about the IDEA project briefly. And then I'll hand it over to Bounmy, who will talk with us about the research. And then I'll follow up and talk with you about the IDEA initiatives that we have developed in response to what we have learned from our research. And then we will go into something called Tick It Out, which gives you an opportunity to share with us some of the key highlights and takeaways that you took from the presentation today. So I'll begin today with a land acknowledgement. So staff at Race and Disability Canada live and work on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. We at Race and Disability Canada acknowledge the legacy of colonization and oppression of Indigenous peoples in Canada and, of course, across the world. We are hopeful that all Indigenous nations have their rights protected and honored. And as a Canada-wide organization committed to tackling the intersections of race and disability, our work is bound with Indigenous solidarity, and we are on a constant journey to uphold this particular commitment. And as I mentioned at the beginning, in terms of me wearing a keffiyeh, I think it's really, really important as we talk about disability justice and disability rights and enhanced accessibility. It's really important to kind of make that connection with what's happening in Palestine right now. The United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities have said that people with disabilities in Gaza are living in extreme distress as they are fearful that they will be the first to be killed because of the limited opportunities to flee or to evacuate due to their physical impairments. The same committee speaks about the absence of advanced warnings available in accessible formats, destruction of communication networks, and the difficulty of movement because of the level of destruction. And our advocacy as a race and disability organization and as advocates for the intersections of race and disability means so our advocacy for a more accessible Canada, a more accessible world, really does necessitate us to have a resounding call for the end to the genocide that is causing unprecedented amounts of disablement in Gaza today. I always find it very difficult doing land acknowledgements and mentioning things like genocide and ongoing disablement in this context. It's not an easy thing to talk about. It's not a light thing to talk about, but I think it is incumbent upon us as we're talking about, forms of oppression to really connect the dots. And of course, there are many other situations and contexts that we should include in these types of statements. But unfortunately, if we did that, we'd be here for a very long time. But Palestine, I think, is a very particular moment in our current history that I believe is a catalyst for talking about these issues in ways that are really, really important. And so naming of this is not meant to erase or exclude other ongoing issues in places like Sudan and the Congo and Kashmir and other places around the world. But it's just, as I said, it's a catalyst, and I hope it's a turning point in our collective history. So moving on then, Race and Disability Canada. Who are we and where did we come from? So our parent organization is called Dean Support Services. They are an organization situated in Mississauga, Ontario, an organization that provides a cross-disability organization that provides day programming for people with intellectual disabilities in a way that is culturally and spiritually relevant. Dean Support Services is led by Rabia Kheder. She is a disability rights advocate and champion on the intersections of race and disability and has been doing this advocacy work for decades. And so she, with her other racialized disabled colleagues at the Organization for Canadians of Tamils with Disabilities, ERDCO, the Ethno-Racial People with Disabilities Coalition of Ontario, and Accessibility for All, came together and they established what we now know as Race and Disability Canada through the inaugural project, the IDEA project that we're going to talk about today. So we are a project of Dean Support Services, and we were founded by the organizations I just mentioned. So generally speaking, at Race and Disability Canada, we conduct research, we provide education, training, and we aim to create tools and resources to support the full inclusion of Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities in Canada. So I mentioned the IDEA project. This is our inaugural project. So inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. So what is it? So it's basically a project to essentially build the capacity of the disability sector around the intersections of race and disability across Canada. And we're doing that in multiple ways. Bounmy will speak to the areas of research or focus that we've had in our research, but essentially everything is around building capacity, because we know and we recognize that the intersections of race and disability is essential to address in our disability services, policies, and programs. But we also know that we are not where we need to be, and this is why this project came to be. And we are funded by the Government of Canada, the Social Development Partnerships Program Disability Component. So many thanks to them for their support. This is a 2-year project. And we're at the first phase of which is wrapping up towards the end of the year, and we're hopeful to engage in phase 2 of the initiative. So stay tuned for more information about that. And if you're not already connected with us via our newsletter, I strongly suggest that you sign up so you can get all the latest news and updates from the work that we are doing. So briefly, in terms of the work that we do, so the IDEA project is essentially to understand the intersections of race and disability in Canada. And we are doing that through multiple means, right? So research is what we'll talk about today. We engage in a lot of partnership development and collaboration. We're engaging in education and training initiatives. And then, of course, we have a knowledge mobilization strategy where we want to share the learning and the research and the outputs with our various communities across the board. So I will now hand it over to our wonderful researcher, Bounmy. And you can take it away, Bounmy, and let me know when you'd like me to hit the button for the next slide.
Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to present some of the findings that we have today. So as Rihanna mentioned, my name is Bounmy, and I go by the pronouns she, her. I was originally a practicing midwife, but due to disability, I'm now a researcher at RDC, a refugee from Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned, I identify with a disability. I'm also a carer to someone with a disability. So just sort of situating myself here. So as Rihanna mentioned, as the IDEA project researcher, I am tasked to sort of do research in understanding the intersections of race and disability in Canada in terms of the disability sector. And mostly this is because of the fact that there is very limited research or statistics that is coming specifically from Canada in terms of Research and Statistics Canada. So next slide. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the methodology that came behind all of this. So the work is led through the advice and knowledge of our Academic Advisory Committee, which is composed of various academics in the disability sector. And if you want to know who is involved in that, you can check our website. But essentially, we decided to work with a mixed method approach. And we sought to look and understand 3 specific groups. One is the Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities in Canada, so the individuals. The second is the mainstream disability organization. And third, specifically organizations that work at the intersections of race and disability. So these groupings were targeted by a survey in the late fall and early winter of last year. And so I thank everyone who has participated and continue to participate. But essentially for the first group, what we wanted to do is sort of understand broadly the topics of employment, health, and education to understand the landscapes in terms of their everyday life. In terms of mainstream disability organizations, what we sought was to sort of understand ways in which we can advance accessibility and inclusion in terms of their service provisions and policy directives. And then in terms of the race and disability organizations, we wanted to sort of understand the challenges and barriers that they face in advancing accessibility and inclusion in Canada. And so within these organizations, because of the fact that there aren't too many that are available, the survey wasn't as strong. And so one of the things to strengthen our research was we decided to do 3 specific focus groups, one which was accessible through ASL. And currently we are looking to do individual interviews and are at the member checking phase in terms of the focus groups. I'll speak a little bit later about the literature review, a little bit more in depth of what we found and how it compares to the research that we found. Okay, next slide. So like I said, I'm going to speak a little bit about the research. So specifically interconnecting organizational data to what the Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities in Canada are looking for in their organization. So in this picture, you can sort of see 2 paths, one with which is a rough terrain, and the other one is idyllic, with which is well-groomed. I think we can all relate to this in some ways in which we meet a juncture in our lives. What we know is that change is difficult, especially for organizations of various scales. There's that fear and discomfort, or the sense of the difficulty when we look down that path of change. There's a lot of unknowns, there's obstacles. You can see here, there's rugged rocks, there's a crack in the road. We ask ourselves, is this the best way to approach the change? If it is the right thing, is it the right way? Our anxiety and worries build up. Not to mention, all of us are very busy with our lives and a job. It sort of makes the other path a little bit easier. That status quo, easily paved, calm, it is what we know. It allows for us to sort of continue in that system that functions really well, because we say to ourselves, our programs are still working, people are still coming to use our resources, so let's just keep down this easier path, this path that we know. When we look at the research that RDC has at addressing the intersections of race and disability, we found that that hesitation of presenting might not actually meet what the Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disability are looking for. So I'll go to the next slide and explain that a bit more. So when we look at organizations, there are some key challenges. And so what we can tell is that there's a lot of fear. Fear of being called a racist, some noted that this was because, in the past, their organization has been called that, or from personal experience. It was clear that that sheer hesitation because of race was a big factor. And that fear was things of getting it wrong, being called out, fear to be offended, fear for misunderstanding, in a sense that what you're saying is not what you intend, but it is said in the wrong way. So the research also showed that even though in the EDI plan that race was part of that conversation, in terms of optics wise, in terms of strategic plan, their board directive, it generally was not operationalized. So it wasn't currently a priority. And when I use that word priority, it necessarily doesn't mean that it isn't part of someone's portfolio, but generally it was placed as an additional item on someone who is already overworked and had a big agenda themselves. And so it usually was seen as something that was dealt with later. And so, it is that piece of that lack of confidence and competency, in terms of leadership, in terms of drive, and mostly because there wasn't that start of that conversation. So that discomfort was a big thing. So I'll go to the next slide. So it becomes sort of like a vicious cycle. So, you have that discomfort, so you don't create that platform to learn or work on. So you continue to, continue with that discomfort. And then you sort of go back to having that sort of item saved for another time, saved for, when it is the right time, secretly hoping that maybe someone else will do it or it will settle out in its own way. But the truth is, when we look at the survey and the sort of communication that we're getting from the Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disability in Canada, is that they're asking for change. And so if you go to the next slide. The survey results really say that wanting of change is because of there's that need for conversation. And so what they're asking for is intersectional supports that are culturally safe. Mental health was a very big theme in terms of all of the questions that we have. Even though we didn't directly ask for it, when we had open text, they oftentimes would mention a lot of it affected their mental health. So what they're looking for is mental health services that sort of consider the intersections. So counselors and therapists that may be trained in understanding these intersectional lenses. They also wanted culturally relevant healthcare services, so translation services that were culturally relevant as well, and multilingual resources and information. They wanted substantially that organizations reflected themselves at various levels of leadership. So not just at that first point person in terms of like, the receptionists or people who are answering phone calls. What they wanted was that, at senior levels in the board level, that the organization reflected that. They also wanted knowledge for the ability to create change. So they wanted resources and education on disability laws and policies, rights, and history. So I'll go to the next slide. And so here are some slides, and I'll read through them. One of the things that RDC was actually a storytelling campaign to showcase, or we interviewed, one of my colleagues interviewed champions in race and disability. And these are some quotes in which they themselves would love to also have in terms of their ideal organizations. So Rabia said, it doesn't look like tokenism. It doesn't look like you're the only one that represents the entire population of racialized people with disabilities around the table, where we're talking accessibility, inclusion, and disability. Wherever a conversation is happening on disability, it should be a diverse group of people and not just diversity that's invisible with whiteness. The actual visible diversity of disability and race and other visible identity markers, which could be expressive of faith and otherwise. And Liza says, what I really want to see in place where Black racialized people with disabilities are leading. I want to see a place where they're getting training to lead, where they're not getting thoughts of as an afterthought. At the end of the day, we are the experts of ourselves. So I have one last other quote in the next slide, which was from Ingrid. Words aren't enough. It's not enough to write good policies. If those are words on paper, how could you make those real, attachable, and meaningful to people with disabilities? Your actions are what you do matters. Okay, next slide. So we go back to this slide. And so what we see is that our community of Indigenous, Black, and racialized people are asking for organizations to lean into that fear and discomfort and that unknown, because for them, those feelings are what bring in those better systems that meet their needs. Because what the status quo right now is not meeting their needs. Rather, the status quo is causing obstacles to services and care that they would like to receive. So I sort of tried to make a visual. So fear and discomfort leads to, that ease for our Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities. If we go into that status quo, those bigger barriers are present for them. Okay, next slide. So the work of RDC and the IDEAL project is to listen to the narratives from the Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities in organizations in order to provide them with the tools and resources to support and enable organization to be reflective of the needs of their communities, and to ensure that the services and policies are accessible to the diversity of disabled communities across the country. So I chose this picture because it shows a reflection of the two sides, but still shows that there's a mountain of work that we need to do. And with nature, things will always be changing. And so we must be willing to constantly change and lean into that discomfort. So next slide. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the IDEAL project. So I talked about the methodology, but in order for it to support the accessibility and inclusion of our Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disability, we decided to approach it in a sort of multifaceted approach where we combine personal narratives, that organizational engagement, and then community learning with rigorous research methods. So the idea with personal stories, and as I mentioned, those quotes and some of the surveys we had was open text, it brings sort of that abstract statistics of life, making them relatable and compelling. When we share these stories, we're not just talking about data points, and that's an important piece. We are highlighting the lived experience of our Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities in Canada. This approach fosters a deeper understanding, encourages actions for those who hear these powerful accounts. And so by incorporating these personal narratives into our advocacy, we aim to sort of create an emotional connection. In terms of involving organizations within the disability sector, ensures that our efforts are both relevant and effective. By collaborating with organizations like yourselves, we can tap into a wealth of knowledge and experience, which helps us to better understand the varied needs of this community. Engaging a wide range of organizations allow us to develop inclusive policies that are grounded in real-world experiences of those who we aim to support. And of course, working together, we can create a more cohesive and impactful support system and maximizing the resources and expertise within the sector. And then doing the literature review allows us to compare and contrast and identify launch-off points for how we conduct our research and write our recommendations. So this approach allows us to build on the successes of others and avoids potential pitfalls. It also ensures that our recommendations are grounded in evidence and best practices, which strengthens our case when advocating for policy change. By staying informed about the latest research and trends in the field, we continuously refine our strategies and ensure that our efforts are aligned with the most current and effective approaches. So the IDEA project is led community project. Essentially what it is to empower communities, enhance policy change and organization change. And that's because RDC, I would say, is centered around that concept of mutual aid, where we heavily lean on collaborative exchanges of resources and services for common benefit. So this work means that we can empower our community with data and action, and it can influence policy reform aimed at enhancing inclusivity. And that's, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that there is a lack of race-based data within the sector in Canada, but working towards a robust data bank will help RDC and many of your organizations to use this data to address policy change. And then we hope to go beyond that data analysis in terms of our reports by sort of help organizations shift towards greater diversity and inclusion in their work by sharing the insights that we have and sort of helping provide the tools that are there. So the next slide, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the results that we got from the survey. I'll just change the slide there, Rihanna, if that's okay.
Oh, next one.
So what the findings sort of told us about the challenges experienced by Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities in Canada is that there were significant barriers to education, employment, and health access, which is not a surprise. There was a trend towards invisible disabilities within our participants. So when I say invisible disabilities, like I mentioned, mental health was a big piece. Chronic disorders that don't manifest in sort of physical attributes were a big thing. And so I think a big piece for a lot of organizations to really think about is those invisible disabilities, the mental health disabilities, and the unique mental health disabilities that come with race. In terms of the findings, I'll go through a little bit of them, and we're hoping to publish these results. But essentially, before I present the results, I want to give my gratitude to all the people that participated in terms of responding to our surveys and being very vulnerable in terms of the results that we have. And so one of the biggest things with our work is that we want to ensure that we narrate in an appropriate manner and sort of allowing us to understand that without the input of this community, we wouldn't be able to sort of have this town hall. So I appreciate everyone that was able to contribute to the data. So in terms of employment barriers, what we found was 62.7% of Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities in Canada faced accessibility obstacles when job seeking. So a few quotes was, they assumed I wouldn't be able to fit. And another one is, I regret I disclosed my disability to my employer, with an exclamation mark. In terms of educational challenges, 70.2 encountered educational accessibility barriers throughout their academic journey. So when we said academic journey, that is sort of from grade school all the way up to post-secondary and continuous education. One of the quotes said, getting rejected again and again, you feel like it's because of your impairment, and that made me want to give up. In terms of racial discrimination impact, a quote that I have here is, being Black is just like a plague to some people. In school, some people distance themselves from me based on that. Inside buses, sometimes you can just see people staying far from where you sit, as if I'm a stain. It really, a really crazy experience for me. In terms of healthcare access, a quote that I have is, my previous doctor would not refer me to a psychiatrist to test me for my ADHD. She told me that I had to do my research and find a psychiatrist for myself for her to refer me. It was very frustrating and frustrating experience. And this health access was very true in terms of invisible disabilities, where a lot of people felt as though no matter what they said or how they said it, they couldn't get through to their care provider that they were suffering and that they had a disability. And as I mentioned, the impact on mental health was a big one and found in all aspects in terms of employment and education and racial discrimination, along with health access. One of the quotes was, honestly, people's reactions towards me is killing my self-worth sometimes. I even think this place is not for me. Okay, so I'll go to the next slide. So truthfully, a lot of this research that we found is not surprising. And when we look at the literature, it sort of goes hand in hand with the history of Canada in terms of its dominance with white supremacy in order to maintain violent control of the narrative. So tools such as colonization, enslavement, and immigration policies are forms of oppressive measures to ensure that systems are in place to both discreetly and overtly allow for racialized and disabled people to not thrive and stay alive. So in terms of colonization, as many people know, Canada is founded on the erasure and the subjection and oppression of Black, Indigenous people via colonization. Genocide of the Indigenous people is a crucial part of Canada's nation building. And what we know is that higher disability rates are among Indigenous communities linked to historical trauma and ongoing discrimination. And, you know, we could have a whole sort of presentation on all three of these topics, but I will just highlight a few of them. In terms of enslavement, slavery is an integral part to Canada's nation building for over 200 years. The transatlantic slave trade was another tool of white imperialism, which involved shipping enslaved people from Africa under horrific conditions. And that persistent legacy of enslavement, such as anti-Black racism, disparities in healthcare, education, and employment, contribute to higher rates of disability within Black communities. And then in terms of immigration, what we know is that we have ableist and racist immigration policies. So immigration policies favor white individuals who fit into narrow definitions of healthy and able-bodied. And medical examinations for permanent residents assess if individuals may be a burden to Canadian healthcare system, which is discriminating against immigrants with disabilities. And as Rihanna mentioned, you know, the situation that's happening in Gaza, that you know, we're with war and displacement of people, there is an increased likelihood of disability amongst these individuals that are forced to move. One of the key pieces that I do want to mention is that in the Immigration and Refugees Protection Act, it actually states that foreign nationals are inadmissible if their health conditions might cause excessive demand on health or social services. So we found a lot of information in terms of the literature review. We're hoping to publish that very soon to be able to sort of showcase those pieces. The other pieces of literature that we did was a literature review that we're hoping to publish that looks at the various intersections of race and disability in terms of the context of the literature that is available. And then also we had a literature review that looked at the best practices in terms of the toolkits for community of practice. I'm going to turn it to Rihanna. So that is essentially the research that we have. And the hope is that with this information and all that we have, RDC will develop various initiatives to be able to provide the tools for our community groups, our Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities in Canada to be able to engage and sort of create that change as well. So Rihanna will go through some of the projects that RDC is doing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Bounmy. So as Bounmy said, I'm going to talk briefly now about what have we done with this research, right? So we set out to kind of understand the intersections of race and disability. As Bounmy mentioned, we have 3 literature reviews, one of which is published on our website. Feel free to go check that out. The other 2 will be coming shortly. And so as we learned, as the findings from the research came through, and through the conversations we have been having with disability sector leaders, we realized that people, organizational leaders, you know, have really good intent around wanting to address intersectionality, want to really push their diversity agenda forward. But we knew, and which was backed up by the research that we have done, that they were challenges and barriers and obstacles. And one of the key barriers, and Bounmy's already mentioned this, was the fear, the hesitation, the lack of knowledge, the lack of confidence to talk about race in any meaningful way, which was a major block for people and organizations advancing the intersections of race and disability. And what we also found from the EDI toolkit literature review is that, you know, one of the things that is missing from regular toolkits is that support and that kind of coaching and mentorship that is not available in a kind of a document that you can download on a website. So we decided to move ahead and think about how can we create a system, a program, an initiative that can actually hopefully be the beginnings of that can be transformative. So a community of practice model is what we have gone with in terms of developing a learning network for decision makers and leaders in the disability sector to come together with their colleagues to learn and discuss the intersections of race and disability in an environment where they can ask their silly questions in inverted commas. Because what we know is that people want to talk about race, but they just don't know how. We use the language of race, racialization. We talk, you know, some of us talk very quickly and openly and very confidently about race because we have those tools, we have that knowledge. But what we recognize is that people are a product of their own lived experience. And if you don't know about race and racialization and the historical injustices and the history of disability oppression in Canada, it is very likely that you're going to be afraid and insecure about having those conversations, not least enacting policies and that affect services and advocacy efforts. So we have this communities of practice. It launched a couple of months ago. We have 3 cohorts: Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. Those are our primary areas for phase 1 of this project. It's going really well. People are responding, the feedback that we're getting tells us that we're kind of hitting the nail on the head in terms of this is the format that people are really looking for. With that, we're also developing idea toolkits, which will be standalone resources that, again, disability sector leaders and others will be able to take to their organization and use to kind of help and facilitate conversations in an appropriate way. So again, stay tuned for the toolkits. They will be coming shortly. I'm deliberately not giving you hard deadlines because things change, as we all know, doing this work in the nonprofit sector. But again, make sure that you are on our newsletter, because that is where you will find a lot of this information. The other thing that we have been working on, or that we have developed, is something called the Idea Practitioners and Professionals Network. So in mainstream disability organizations, we have people who are tasked with the diversity portfolio. So they are kind of middle of the ladder in terms of hierarchy, middle manager level positions. They are tasked with identifying what do we need in order to be more inclusive, how can we engage with Indigenous, Black, or racialized people with disabilities. However, they're not responsible for the budget, they don't have any official power, and they are tasked with kind of recommending institutional change. We know the challenges and the struggles of this type of role. The role is important. This is where I started off my work in the disability sector many moons ago back in England. But we also know it's a challenging job to do. So we created this network where these individuals can come together, share their best and promising practices, share resources and information, and really just network and kind of learn from each other and lean into really thinking about strategies that they can implement across the board. So this is live, so you can go to our website. If you are that person in a disability organization tasked with the diversity or DEI portfolio, this is the place for you guys, and we're hoping to have a meet and greet early summer, I believe, and hopefully as well in the fall. We will also be having a LinkedIn group where we can kind of encourage dialogue and conversation. And of course, as people join, we want it to be something that where it can be useful for individuals in this particular role. So we're always happy and welcome feedback with us to kind of figure out ways in which we can support this network to be useful and a positive addition to the work that people are doing. So there's that's on the website, check that out. Bounmy has mentioned the storytelling initiative that we have. We had some screenshots from Rabia, from Lisa, from the O'Shea Foundation, and we had one from Ingrid Palmer from Racialized. And so the idea of that is really to amplify, celebrate, acknowledge, promote racialized disability leaders, but also racialized Indigenous, Black, racialized people with disabilities and their lived experiences. We also want to amplify the work and the voices of racialized disability organizations. Oftentimes people as individuals face systemic barriers, but when you're an individual with a disability and you're running an organization, you can imagine like the compounded effect of the barriers that people experience. So again, we're trying to amplify, celebrate, and promote the lived experiences of Indigenous, Black, racialized people with disabilities, and check that out. That is on our Instagram page. And again, this is also adding to the narratives, right? So the data will tell us one story, but the narratives and the lived experiences of individuals and leaders tell us sometimes complex information that support what we know to be true in terms of the data, but also sometimes adds context to data that doesn't necessarily reflect the lived reality. So that is an ongoing initiative. So do check out our Instagram page for that. The other initiative we're taking, Bounmy had mentioned earlier too, right, that we take a multi-pronged approach to the work that we're doing. So we recognize that Indigenous, Black, racialized people with disabilities are not a monolith, right? Within any one specific community that experience a particular type of disablement, there is diversity within that group. So any initiative, any research, any program that we aim to offer will not work for everybody. So taking a multi-pronged approach in the research, but also in our programming is essential, because it's in recognition of the fact that our communities are diverse. And so we're trying to do different different things. So we took an approach where we looked at organizations and how we can support them and figure out tools and resources for them. And then we're looking at individuals as well in terms of what did they tell us that they wanted. So Bounmy mentioned that people had said that they wanted information, education, and training on the intersections of race and disability. They wanted to know about law and policy. They also wanted to know about advocacy and leadership skills and development. So we're creating an Indigenous, Black, racialized people with disabilities development program. This is a webinar series that, again, will roll out specifically for Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver, but it's available for anyone across the country. And this is really a way to develop capacity of individuals, but really making it real. So Amira Brown, who is a tech support for today, she is our community learning coordinator. She's heading up that particular initiative. And I tell you, the curriculum looks epic. And also we're focusing heavily as well on the recognition about self-care and well-being. Learning about the history of disability oppression as it relates to you as an individual is not an easy task, right? It's not an easy endeavor. It has a real life material impact. It's not something that you can just attend this webinar for an hour or two and then close your laptop and then go enjoy a lovely dinner or go to the park or whatever. So really thinking and talking very critically about self-care and well-being, developing strategies and understanding about how to keep yourself going in this context of self-advocacy and leadership on the intersections of race and disability is a key component of this project as well. Stay tuned for more information. Again, sign up for our newsletter and then you will be the first to know as to when those initiatives, that particular program, will roll out. What we're also learning from individuals that we've spoken to and community members and our staff is that, again, the needs of Indigenous, Black, racialized people with disabilities is not, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So really thinking, people have mentioned about the need for, or the desire for networking, for knowing other people, for connecting with other individuals with a similar lived experience or similar barriers and challenges, and also wanting a space where people can connect, make friendships, establish different connections, but also potentially an opportunity to share resources, exchange learning opportunities, and exchange opportunities for employment and other opportunities as well. So the Race and Disability Canada peer network is something that we're actively working on to develop. Again, stay tuned for that in terms of when that will launch. And again, we're hoping for this to be something that's actually useful for Indigenous, Black, racialized people with disabilities. So we're really trying to be diligent and mindful about creating something that has impact and is useful for the diversity of individuals that we are trying to support in different ways. So that brings us to the end of kind of the formal presentation that we have. As I said, we're really busy, right? This is a really busy time in terms of implementation. A lot of these programs have been launched and we're in the midst of, really implementing and receiving the feedback. Actually, the work that we're doing is phase 1 of the project, and it's a pilot. So everything that we are doing is with the intent of developing it further. So we're always looking for feedback from our participants and the organizations that we collaborate with. And so we're very much excited for the next phase to kind of scale these initiatives up and make them more robust and more relevant, in terms of advancing the accessibility and inclusion agenda that we all have. So that brings us to the end of kind of